Oh yeah. So I tried that extension, and the only thing it gave me was put me in this strange white room, and it was like glitching like crazy. I couldn't get it to like work normal. I was really bummed out.
That's weird because it took me like a day for it to actually pop up, and I had to like refresh, and I like went to the frequently asked questions and stuff like that to see what was going on, but it took it like a day to come back like
Huh.
clean.
Weird. Yeah, it didn't work well for me because I wanted to see if I can give myself a halo to fool all of you. Anyways, the Mongols. So we talked about their military successes last year, or not yet last year, yesterday, and how they totally kick keister everywhere. So what are some of the reasons? We talked about speed. Why else? Well, first off, if you were a dude between ages 15 to 60, meaning you're pretty much all of the able-bodied men alive, because people didn't live to be that old typically back then, you were eligible for the army, meaning you could be conscripted, meaning they say, congratulations, Sahil, you get to fight for good old Uncle Genghis, or Chinggis, they would have said, instead of Uncle Sam, Uncle Chinggis, picture him with one of those hats. I want you. Yeah, he did. But here's the thing, too. The military, just like how we talked about in Sparta last year, how that was how a man was a man. It was the same thing for the Mongols. Like, if you wanted to be like a manly man, if you wanted to have any kind of pride or honor, it was through warfare. Are you capable of doing what you had to do, fighting bravely, charging into battle? But they also kind of treated everything like a war. Like, even when they went hunting, they treated it like a military exercise where they're surrounding their enemy, they're flanking, they're doing all sorts of things. So they're always practicing. And they would go and hunt tons and tons of animals, and they would, bring it back and, have huge feasts. They were also extremely disciplined. And next week, bless you, darling, they are going to go and we're going to see how they had strict rules. So, for example, they divided their soldiers up into units, much like we do today. And they were based on tens. So you have your tens, your hundreds, your thousands. And so we have, Mide's group of 10. Now, we all know that Sarah is extremely brave, and there were some female Mongol warriors. It wasn't super common, but there did. So Sarah's super brave. Sarah charges into battle, but the rest of Mide's and Sarah's 10 do not. Guess what? Sarah was brave. The others were not. So that means the whole 10 have to be executed. I know, right? So that means Mide now has to be brave like Sarah. Yeah, I know. It'll be tough because she's extremely brave. Or we have an instance where it's a tactical retreat. They need to pull back because they're losing. Now, Campbell retreats. All 10 of Campbell's, Campbell and her other 9, they have to retreat too. Or else then executions. So it's one of those things that you had to operate completely together or else. And guess what? If we have some of the 10s being executed, it could be the group of 100 being executed. And you see that this seems very serious, but you don't have to do it that often. You only have to really do it, once or twice. And then people learn, you better follow the orders. You gotta, crack a few eggs to make an omelet, guys. Now, one of the things, too, is they're going to be very different. Typically, when you have a massive army moving, which the Mongols would be considered, moving as a massive army, you'd have some huge supply lines. You'd have carts and carts of goods going behind you. The Mongols didn't need that. They went, and because they're all mounted, they're all going at high speed on their horses, and they gathered from the land. They took from there, kind of like, locusts descending on a field. They would eat everything, take it all, and they would go and, burn things behind them so that their enemies couldn't get them. We talked about their mail system, so they had good information spreading back and forth. But one of the other things that they do is completely unique to the time, and this is going to boggle your mind. You are not going to believe that other people didn't do this, but they actually did planning and reconnaissance. Back then, typically the armies marched mostly blind. They might put, a couple guys on horseback, going a few miles ahead of them. but the Mongols would plan out their invasion routes. They would go and send sometimes groups months out ahead of time to scout the enemy, to say, Isha would go and look and say, okay, we think there's about 100,000 people in this city. We see these are the entrances. It looks like they have these kind of fortifications. They would know exactly what they're running into. Whereas when the Mongols came, by the time you realized they were there, because we talked about how they go 60 to 80 miles a day, it was already too late. You didn't know they were coming. And once you find out they're coming, you're done. You're dead. Or you might surrender and then you could survive. But another thing is they adapted to the different situations. So, for example, there's a story when they were going and invading northern China. There was a city, and I can't remember what the city's name was, but it was right by a river, and there was a huge wall. And the Mongols had not yet learned siege warfare. Now, they will learn siege warfare from the Chinese. Siege warfare is, of course, attacking a fortified city or things like that. But because they hadn't figured those things out yet, we saw yesterday in our homework how they built a bridge out of boats so they could charge across and then go and fight the battle. Well, the Mongols at this instance, they actually dammed the river up, diverted the river's flow to go right into the walls of the city to knock down the walls so that they can then go in and kill everybody. So they saw a problem and then they solved it. Unfortunately, the solution for the problems ended in death and destruction, but this was the Mongols. They saw problems and they fixed them. They moved a river's flow to destroy a city. That's pretty hardcore, folks. But then after they wound up conquering a lot of the Chinese, they wound up taking some of the Chinese technology and using it for themselves. And this is one of the things that makes the Mongols so successful, is because they're taking the best things in the different armies that they fight, and they wind up going and using it to their advantage. Things like the Chinese fire lance, which was the earliest versions of guns. The Chinese we're going to learn about later on this year, they're going to be the first people to use fireworks. And fireworks, we use them on the 4th of July and, after Keys games for entertainment because, the colors. Back then, if you saw something exploding in the sky, it was a terrifying thing because you are not accustomed to things exploding in the sky. So when the Mongols see the Chinese firework and they say, this is very useful, they say, yes, let's use that. They go and they learn like the techniques of going and tunneling under walls and setting fires like sappers, and then making walls crumble down in front of you. They learned the catapult. They learned, all sorts of things from their enemies, and then they use them. And, like I said before, all of these pictures of Chinggis Khan, this is what people guess that he looked like. We don't know what he looked like for certain. No one ever went and did a portrait. He was too busy conquering to sit down and get a portrait taken of him. So these are all guesses because you all see they all look pretty different because we have no idea what the man looked like. So the Mongols, they took the technology, but they also took some of the people. There's a great story about the Mongols going and offering a Chinese general who fought against them really well, said, hey, if you want to live, you can fight on our side and be one of us. And he took him up on it because, he already lost, he conquered, and he was able to go and be a general still. And he wound up becoming an important Mongolian general, even though he was Chinese. So even people, if they were useful to the Mongols, they would keep you alive and let you become one of them, which, is better than getting killed, right? All right, so psychological warfare. The Mongols, part of the reason why they're successful too is because they would get in your head. They would trick you, they would confuse you, and they would make you terrified. In our song, we say they feign retreats and then come upon you. So one of the things the Mongols love to do is so they'd send a little itty bitty amount of Mongols to attack the Jacob. And, Jacob, he's got his army there, and he manages to battle those Mongols off. And, they think, wow, these Mongols, they aren't so scary. Come on, we're handling them way better. This is a piece of cake. And so one of the things, we talked about this some last year. In battle back then, with how people fought, the majority of the casualties, meaning people that are wounded or killed, happened actually at the very end. So when Jacob's going and battling, when he then goes and has his men chase the enemy down, that's when the actual real most of the violence happens, when people really get hurt or killed, because in front of you you've got your armor, you've had your shield, but your back pretty open. So what would typically happen is after you go and fight the enemy off, you then chase them and kill them. That's what you do, because especially because you're really ticked off, because it's not easy work battling. You probably are tired. You're probably hurt somewhat because you got some bruises and sore. So you want to get out some aggression. So Jacob, he battled off the Mongols, so then they chased them. But that is exactly what the Mongols wanted, because they weren't really fighting their best. It was all a plan. And it leads them, of course, into a nice open area where then there are more Mongols, which encircle them. They feign retreats and come upon them, only saving those who would serve them. Yeah, they would then, annihilate the enemy. One of the things, too, is as they're going, since they use horse archers, which the Europeans did not, they would be able to, turn around, fire back as you're pursuing them. It was not a good thing. But here's the thing, too. As we talked about, Genghis Khan would slaughter entire cities. Next week, when we're looking at some primary sources, we're going to see that there are going to be cities like literally that have over 1 million people that get killed. So they would do this, though, not necessarily because they loved the violence, but because if, Aden destroys a whole city, when Aden shows up to Mide's city, Mide might just say, I surrender, so that doesn't happen to him. So he would wipe out entire cities so that other cities would surrender. Then you don't have to have the battle at all. So we see how, in some ways, maybe it helped, others by going and wiping out an entire city, but it's still pretty horrible. But here's the thing, too. They sweeten the deal. If you surrendered, you didn't have any resistance, typically you would be spared. So we talked about yesterday how they'd go around collecting years and killing people, and wiping everyone out and then coming back after a couple days to make sure there's no one left. If you just surrendered, often you just got to live peacefully. You now paid your taxes to the Mongols, and that was that. Other times, they would capture some of the people, and they would then be forced in front of the Mongolian army. And they would basically be human shields. So they might attack a nearby town, maybe where your cousins or relatives or in-laws are at. Capture some of those people, they would put them in front of the Mongol army. So then when your defenses for the next town are going and, shooting those arrows, doing all that stuff, guess who those arrows are hitting? They're hitting your own townsmen instead of Mongols. So sometimes they didn't spare. But like we said, if you resisted, it's typically annihilation. You don't have to write this last little story on the bottom here, but there's a famous story where we have a bunch of Persian merchants. They wanted to get to China to continue the Silk Road. They hadn't heard about what happened with the Mongols in China yet. So they're traveling east. And far off in the distance, they see mountaintops. So they're getting excited, thinking, okay, we're almost to India here because we see the mountaintops. As they get closer, it's very, very smelly. Very, very smelly. And they get closer and they realize that those are not mountains that they see, but it was the piles of bones left after the Mongols had wiped out cities. The sun-bleached bones. So they thought they were snow-covered mountains in the distance, and they realized they were sun-bleached bones. And these merchants, they just turned around. They said, it is not worth running into whatever those poor people came across. Yeah, it's wild. It's crazy. Wild and crazy. Yeah, yuck indeed. And so we've got a quote now coming from a contemporary, a Persian during the 13th century, so in the 1200s. In one stroke, a world which billowed with fertility was laid desolate, and the regions thereof became a desert, and the greater part of the living and their skin and bones crumbling in the dust, and the mighty were humbled and immersed with the calamities of perdition. So they say they took what was fertile, which was beautiful, like having all so much, and then they made it a desert. How they destroyed everything that came across their path. Now, that's going to end our notes for the day on that cheery note. We're going to see it's not all just murder and massacre, though, as we continue on later on, thankfully, because it's kind of hard to stomach too much more of this, am I right? So don't worry. I think we've gotten past the worst, except maybe the spreading of the plague, which we'll talk about later on. So I'm stopping the recording now. Oh, wait.